What if the scariest monsters were never hiding in the dark, but living normal lives, walking past you every day? Tonight, you will hear real horror stories so disturbing, governments tried to silence them, police failed to explain them, and witnesses wished they had never seen the truth. These are not ghost stories. These are not myths. Every fact you're about to hear actually happened. And by the end of this video, you may never trust the world the same way again. In February 1959, deep in the frozen Ural Mountains of Russia, a group of 9 experienced hikers vanished under circumstances so disturbing that even today, investigators hesitate to give a final explanation. What makes this case truly horrifying is not just how they died, but how their own actions before death defy every known survival instinct. The hikers were young, physically strong, and trained to survive extreme cold. Their leader, Igor Dialov, had planned the expedition carefully. Weather reports, supplies, and route calculations were all done professionally. Nothing suggested danger. Yet on the night of February 1st, something terrified them so badly that they abandoned their tent in the middle of a snowstorm barefoot, half-dressed, and without weapons or food. When rescuers later found the campsite, the first chilling detail became clear. The tent had been cut open from the inside. This was not panic caused by snow accumulation or a structural failure. The tent was intact, no avalanche marks, no animal tracks. Yet the hikers chose to slash their only shelter and escape into deadly temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Footprints told an even stranger story. They were not running. They were walking calmly, some in socks, some barefoot, moving downhill into the forest as if whatever scared them was worse than freezing to death. This detail alone continues to haunt investigators because fear that strong must come from something immediate, invisible, and overwhelming. The first 2 bodies were found near a tree, barefoot, with signs of burns on their hands and broken branches above them, suggesting they tried desperately to climb the tree. Why climb? Were they trying to escape something on the ground or get a better view of something approaching? Their skin was blackened by frostbite, and their fingers were raw, as if they had clawed at the bark until they could no longer feel pain. As search teams moved deeper, they discovered 3 more bodies scattered between the tree and the tent, positioned as if they were trying to return. Their faces were frozen in expressions that rescuers later described as not peaceful. One had a cracked skull. Another had internal bleeding, yet no external wounds. It was as if massive force had been applied without breaking the skin. But the real horror came months later, when the snow melted. The remaining 4 bodies were found buried in a ravine. Their injuries shocked even hardened professionals. One woman was missing her tongue. Another had crushed ribs, comparable to injuries from a high-speed car accident. Still, there were no external cuts, no signs of a fight, and no evidence of another group being present. Radiation was detected on some of their clothing. This single fact opened the door to terrifying theories, military experiments, secret weapons tests, infrasound-induced panic, even unknown natural phenomena. But none fully explain why trained hikers would behave in a way that guaranteed death. The official Soviet conclusion was disturbingly vague. An unknown compelling force caused the hikers to abandon the tent and perish. No force was named. No explanation given. The case was closed. Years later, when photographs from the investigation were declassified, another unsettling detail emerged. Some photos appeared to show a dark humanoid shape in the distance standing upright in the snow. Others show strange light orbs in the sky during the same time period. Locals in the region spoke of seeing glowing spheres that night. Indigenous Mansi people refused to approach the area, calling it cursed long before the incident. Even modern reinvestigations failed to bring comfort. Avalanche theory doesn't explain the injuries. Animal attacks don't match the wounds. Human involvement leaves no tracks, no weapons, no motive. Nature alone doesn't explain radiation. What remains is a silent question buried in ice. What frightened 9 capable humans so deeply that they chose certain death over staying inside their tent for even one more minute? In 1988, Japan was shaken by a crime so brutal, so deeply disturbing, that many details were deliberately kept from the public for years. Not because the facts were unclear, but because they were too horrifying to fully comprehend. This wasn't the work of a serial killer stalking the shadows. This horror unfolded in a normal house, in a quiet neighborhood, while society moved on outside as if nothing was wrong. Her name was Junko Furuta. She was just 17 years old. Junko was an ordinary high school student, quiet, polite, and hardworking. One evening, while walking home from her part-time job, she was abducted by a group of teenage boys. What makes this case especially terrifying is that these boys weren't hardened criminals from some dark underworld. They were students, sons, neighbors. One of them, however, had connections to the Japanese Yakuza, which gave him a chilling confidence that he was untouchable. At first, Junko believed she would be released. She cooperated, followed their instructions, and hoped that compliance would be her salvation. The boys subjected her to relentless physical and psychological abuse. She was beaten daily, burned, starved, deprived of sleep. They used humiliation as a weapon, forcing her to believe that no one was coming for her, that even if she screamed, no one would care. And the most horrifying truth: she did scream. Neighbors heard noises, cries, sounds of violence. But no one called the police. Some dismissed it as family fighting. Others simply didn't want to get involved. Evil doesn't always survive because it is strong. Sometimes it survives because good people look away. As days turned into weeks, the torture escalated. Her body began to shut down, but the abuse only intensified. She was denied medical care, even when she could no longer walk properly. When she begged to die, they laughed at her. When she pleaded to see her parents, they mocked her. In their eyes, she was no longer a human being, but an object for their cruelty. What darkens this case even further is not just the violence, but the complete moral collapse surrounding it. Because the perpetrators were minors, their identities were initially protected by the law. Their sentences were shockingly light compared to the severity of their actions. One was released early. Another was later heard bragging about what he had done. Some of them went on to live seemingly normal lives. Junko's parents were forced to watch as the system failed their daughter in the most profound way. This case is often discussed in whispers online, sometimes appearing on dark web forums where users obsess over real horror instead of fictional fear. But Junko's story is not entertainment. It is proof that the most terrifying monsters don't always hide in the dark web, in abandoned buildings, or in remote forests. Sometimes they live in houses with the lights on, surrounded by people who choose silence over action. To this day, Junko Furuta's name represents a haunting truth. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it sounds like laughter behind closed doors. And sometimes the scariest part is realizing how many chances there were to stop it and how none were taken. This is not a ghost story. There is no mystery here. There is only a question that still chills the spine. How many horrors exist right now, not because they are hidden, but because we choose not to see them? In the darkest corners of the internet, there exists a rumor so persistent that many believe it must be real, not because it has been proven, but because fragments of truth keep surfacing around it. This rumor is known as red rooms, supposedly live-streamed torture or murder shows, accessible only through the dark web, paid for with cryptocurrency, where viewers vote on what happens next. For years, authorities claimed they were nothing more than urban legends. But the real horror is not whether red rooms exist exactly as described. The real horror is what has already been confirmed. In the early 2010s, investigators began uncovering a pattern on hidden forums, users sharing encrypted links, countdown timers, and private shows. At first glance, these looked fake cheap horror roleplay meant to scare newcomers. But as law enforcement dug deeper, they discovered something far worse. Not staged violence, not actors, but real people being exploited, recorded, and sold, sometimes live, sometimes archived, always hidden behind layers of anonymity. One of the most chilling truths about the dark web is that it doesn't to create evil, it removes consequences. When identity disappears, morality often follows. In multiple international investigations, police found live streaming setups in ordinary apartments. Cameras mounted carefully, lighting adjusted, audio tested, not for entertainment, but for crimes being broadcast to strangers across the world. Viewers didn't see themselves as criminals, they saw themselves as audience, observers, participants in something exclusive. In some cases, chat logs revealed viewers encouraging acts, sending tips, or requesting specific actions. Not because they were forced to, but because they could. The screen created distance. Distance created permission. One investigator later stated that what disturbed him most wasn't the violence itself, but the calm language used in chats. No panic, no shock. Just casual messages, as if people were discussing a video game. Another lesser-known fact: many of these streams didn't last long. Not because they were stopped, but because they were too risky. Once enough viewers joined, exposure increased. So operators adapted. They moved to short-duration broadcasts, invite-only rooms, and pre-recorded proof videos sent privately to paying users. This shattered the red room myth in a terrifying way. The fantasy wasn't exaggerated. It was simplified. Real dark web crimes don't need dramatic stages or countdown clocks. They thrive in silence, in private messages, in file transfers labeled with harmless names. What people imagine as theatrical horror is, in reality, methodical and efficient. Even more unsettling is how many viewers were never caught. Cryptocurrency transactions vanish into chains of numbers. Servers bounce across countries. Jurisdiction collapses. By the time a site is shut down, its users are already somewhere else, watching, waiting, paying. Psychologists studying these cases uncovered another dark layer. Repeated exposure changed people. Viewers reported needing more extreme content over time to feel anything. The screen numbed empathy. Real suffering became background noise. One former dark web user, interviewed anonymously after arrest, said something chilling. That there is a global audience willing to watch real pain if they believe no one is watching them. Law enforcement agencies rarely publicize these cases fully, not to protect criminals, but to protect the public from copycat behavior and psychological damage. Many details remain sealed. Many files are never shown in courtrooms, only described, and many victims remain unnamed. The dark web doesn't need monsters in masks or dramatic music. It only needs anonymity, curiosity, and the belief that a screen makes everything unreal. But every stream has a room behind it. Every video has a moment where someone pressed record. And every viewer made a choice. The most terrifying fact is not that such horrors happen online. Fact 4. In the 1930s, while America was struggling through the Great Depression, a man walked the streets who looked harmless, elderly, thin, polite, and deeply religious. Parents trusted him. Children felt safe around him. Neighbors described him as quiet and respectful. His name was Albert Fish, and what he hid behind that appearance remains one of the darkest realities ever uncovered in criminal history. Albert Fish was not driven by rage or impulse. He was driven by calculation. What makes this case terrifying is not just what he did, but how long he did it without suspicion. Fish targeted children, often those from poor families, because he knew desperation created silence. He would offer money, gifts, or help. Sometimes he pretended to be a kind grandfather, sometimes a job recruiter, always calm, always patient. He did not rush. Fish kept journals, detailed ones. In them, he recorded his thoughts, his urges, and his crimes in a disturbing, almost clinical way. These writings revealed a mind completely detached from empathy. Pain to him was not an act of violence, it was an experience to be studied, controlled, and repeated. One of the most unsettling facts about Albert Fish is that he was never suspected for years, even after multiple children went missing. Why? Because he didn't fit the image people expected. He didn't lurk in dark alleys. He didn't act aggressively. He attended church. He quoted the Bible. He spoke about morality. This contradiction allowed him to hide in plain sight. The case finally unraveled not through police intelligence, but through his own arrogance. Fish sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims. It was not a confession meant to shock. It was a narrative, cold, descriptive, written as if he were telling a story rather than admitting a crime. He believed he was too clever to be caught. That letter became his undoing. Investigators traced the stationery. It led them to a boarding house, and finally to Albert Fish himself. When arrested, what shocked police was not panic or denial but relief. Fish reportedly told officers that he had expected to be caught eventually. He believed his actions were driven by forces beyond his control. In his mind, he was not evil, he was obedient to his own twisted interpretation of destiny and religion. Psychological evaluations revealed something even darker. Fish experienced pain as pleasure, not only inflicting it, but receiving it. X-rays later found dozens of needles embedded inside his body, deliberately inserted over years. He did this to himself, quietly, secretly, without anyone noticing. This detail alone changed how criminologists understood extreme deviance. Fish wasn't impulsive. He wasn't chaotic. He was disciplined, which made him infinitely more dangerous. During his trial, Fish spoke calmly. He showed no remorse. When asked if he felt guilt, he answered that he believed God wanted him to do what he did. This was not insanity in the way people imagine madness. This was structured belief built slowly, reinforced internally, and never questioned. Experts later stated that if he had lived in the modern digital age, he might have gone even longer without detection. Online anonymity, access to vulnerable communities, and the ability to create false identities would have made someone like Fish nearly invisible. That is the most chilling lesson of this case. Not that monsters exist, but that they can blend perfectly into society, wearing kindness like a mask. Albert Fish was executed in 1936, but his case continues to be studied not because of gore or shock, but because it exposes a terrifying truth. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it quotes scripture. And sometimes it only reveals itself when it wants to be seen. The real horror is not that Albert Fish existed. The real horror is realizing how many people like him could exist undetected, unnoticed, and trusted at any moment. Fact number 5. In 1974, a series of ordinary classified ads began appearing in newspapers across Kansas City. They were simple, polite, almost boring. The ass asked for help with small tasks: painting, moving furniture, fixing minor household problems. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. And that is exactly why they worked. The man behind them was Dennis Rader, later known as the BTK killer. Bind, torture, kill. What makes this case truly terrifying is not just the number of lives he took, but how deliberately invisible he remained for decades. Rader didn't live on the edges of society. He was a church leader, a husband, a father, a compliance officer, the kind of man neighbors trusted with their children. And he enjoyed that trust. Rader planned his crimes like projects. He stalked victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, their fears, their vulnerabilities. He created projects in his mind, assigning victims code names. This emotional distance allowed him to view human beings as tasks to be completed, not lives to be taken. One disturbing unknown fact about BTK is that he often fantasized more than he acted. The killings were rare compared to the constant mental rehearsals. He would relive crimes repeatedly in his mind, refining them, improving them. In his own words, the fantasy was sometimes more satisfying than reality. This is why he was able to stop killing and not stop being dangerous. For years, police believed the killer had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or left the state. In reality, Rader was still there, watching news reports, reading about himself, writing poems about his murders, dressing up in women's clothing and binding himself with ropes to recreate scenes from his crimes. He called these moments his private projects. Another chilling fact: Rader wanted to be caught, but only on his terms. He sent letters to police and media, taunting them, correcting their mistakes, demanding recognition. But when attention faded, he faded too, not out of guilt, but out of boredom. He had learned patience. In the early 2000s, after decades of silence, BTK returned not to kill, but to communicate. He sent a message to police asking a question he believed would keep him safe: "Can I communicate with floppy disk without being traced?" Police publicly lied and said yes. Rader believed them. That single moment of arrogance ended his freedom. The floppy disk he sent contained hidden metadata tracing back to a church computer, his church, his account, his name. When police arrested him in 2005, they didn't find a monster screaming or resisting. They found a calm man who asked politely if the handcuffs were necessary. During interrogation, once confronted with evidence, he confessed in disturbing detail, not with emotion, but with pride. He corrected investigators. He explained his methods. He wanted the record to be accurate. In court, something even more unsettling happened. Rader described his murders as if he were giving a lecture. He used technical language. He smiled. He showed no empathy. Families of victims later said the hardest part was not hearing what he did, but realizing how little it meant to him. Psychologists later concluded that BTK's greatest weapon was self-control. He blended into routine so perfectly that even his own family had no idea. The final terrifying truth about BTK is this: he didn't stop because he wanted to. He stopped because life got busy: work, family, responsibilities. Killing was postponed, not abandoned. That fact changed how law enforcement understands long-term threats. Some killers don't burn out. They hibernate. BTK reminds us of a reality far darker than sudden violence. That someone can live a completely normal life while carrying something unspeakable inside them, patiently, quietly, waiting for the moment they feel unseen again.